What's up, y'all? Welcome to Flames Reaction Channel. So today's video, I'm getting ready to react Tony Yayo. And with that being said, man, make sure you hit that like, comment, and subscribe. And let's dig into this video. Check out the best of Tony Yayo and his great moments of hip hop.
Tony Yayo was born Marvin Bernard on March 31st in 1978 in the neighborhood known as South Jamaica, Queens in New York City. His parents were of Haitian descent and Marvin was the youngest of three siblings. According to his own memory of events, Marvin had what he called a good upbringing, albeit not a simple one, especially after his parents divorced when he was only a teenager. Reflecting on this event in his life, he told Today in 2005, "When you're younger, you don't understand stuff like that. As I got older, I understood they didn't like each other anymore. My mother did most of the working. She was a nurse's aide and turned into a registered nurse. However, the most important event in Marvin's young life was when he met his neighbors Curtis James Jackson, aka 50 Cent, and Lloyd Banks. These three young men would quickly form a friendship that would evolve into the hip hop collective known around the world as G Unit, where Marvin would adapt the name of Tony Yayo as an allusion to Tony Montana from Scarface and the slang word of yayo meaning cocaine. I think Rick James is probably a fan of Tony's name. Just saying. That's corny. Don't use that. From the moment these three first started hanging out with one another, they began working on music. But they also did something else, get into a hell of a lot of trouble on the streets. Tony's father always warned him to stay off the boulevard, but of course that only made Tony want to check out what was going on there all the more. After his father left the picture, Tony hit the streets and discovered that 50 had already been running them since he was around 12 years old.
Yayo was rapping first. I was just in the street.
From that point forward, there was always something of a push and pull between the streets and the recording studio. Having seen the success of acts like the Lost Boys and the late rapper Freaky Ta, local artists that paved the way for G Unit, suddenly these three young men believed that they could achieve their dreams by breaking into mainstream hip hop. In the early 2000s, they began to produce and record a series of mixtapes like 50 Cent is the Future and God's Plan. In between laying down vocals in the studio, Tony would also have 50's back whenever they hit the streets. Like that time, G Unit got into a major altercation with Ja Rule's Murder Inc. After an altercation between 50 and Ja Rule broke out in an Atlanta nightclub, the feud between these two groups would escalate to a point that in March of 2000, an infamous brawl broke out between the collectives at the Hit Factory in New York City.
You want to call yourself a murderer? Then you need murderers around you to make it believable.
In the fight, Black Child stabbed 50 Cent in several.
Ads on YouTube must be so annoying, but with 3 clicks, you can install an ad blocker.
Others.
This was the night that 50 was infamously stabbed. Although Yayo has suggested in the recent past that the stabbing wasn't nearly as significant as it was mythologized to be at the time, even going so far to say that 50 walking out with nothing more than a scratch. But while Yayo was there for his OGs when they needed him most, a sudden twist of fate would ensure he wouldn't be there when all their hard work began to pay off. On New Year's Eve 2002, Tony Yayo and 50 Cent were arrested for weapons possession when police discovered that Tony had a Glock 20 and a Colt AR-15 in the trunk of his car during a traffic stop. Weapons that he claims were not his, but owned by G Unit security. Regardless of who the weapons belonged to, during a background check, the police came to realize that Tony had an outstanding warrant from a previous weapons possession charge, and this would result in him spending the next year behind bars.
They staged it. You know what I'm saying? They told us we was in a traffic violation and made us move. And then as soon as we pulled off,
while Yayo was stuck in prison, 50 Cent's career, and by de facto G Units, began to take off thanks to the success of Get Rich or Die Trying. Afterwards, 50 was granted his own Instagram subsidiary of G Unit Records, and he quickly signed his day ones in Lloyd Banks and Tony Yayo, even though Tony was incarcerated at the time. G Unit's ranks would continue to swell and come to include new members like Young Buck in the Gang. But that's not to say they forgot about Yayo, because they didn't. In fact, during this time, 50 and his fellow G Unit members would all wear free Yayo shirts frequently in their music videos. Through all of this, Yayo actually had no idea what was going on. In fact, the first time he ever had an inkling of what was actually happening is when he was finally convinced by the inmates in the television room to turn on the Grammy Awards, only to discover that Eminem was performing Lose Yourself on stage while wearing a free Yayo shirt. Inspired by what he had just seen, Yayo got to work on refining his rap and lyrical skills with all the free time he had on his hands. He also kept in touch with the G Unit members, who let him know that his opportunity was going to happen as soon as he got out. Come January of 2004, Yayo was back on the streets, but only for a hot second. While trying to go on tour the day after his release, Yayo was put back in prison for a few weeks when he mistakenly handed his parole officer what turned out to be his brother's passport. A few more weeks on the inside and Yayo was finally out again, this time for good. But upon his release, he got right to work recording what would become his debut album, the long-ass title, Thoughts of a Predicate Felon. Boasting the single So Seductive, Yayo's album would peak at the #2 spot on the Billboard 200
I remember that
on its
video by
path to
Tony
selling
Yayo.
more than 1 million units worldwide. Yet despite the unquestionable commercial success, Tony Yayo would never go on to release another professional project, at least not at this point in time. A whole host of mixtapes, sure, but not an actual studio album. He'd still continue to appear on G-Unit albums and mixtapes, but his role subtly shifted into becoming more of a hype man for the collective than necessarily a featured artist. And that's okay. I mean, Tony Yayo, it needs to be said, is one of the best hype men of all time. Simply put, Tony didn't really have the same skill with wordplay as someone like Banks or even the appealing southern twang of Young Buck. Instead, what Tony is the best at and continues to be the best at is finding ways to hype people up, especially when it comes to his legendary ad-libs. He'd also become something of a pretty major influence on professional wrestling, through in a roundabout way. I mean, have you guys ever heard of John Cena? I mean, who am I kidding? Of course you have. This man has granted more wishes for the Make-A-Wish Foundation than any other person in the world. Well, Cena's infamous catchphrase, "You can't see me," yeah, it was actually created by Yayo as a dance move in one of his early music videos. But I gotta say, this had a generation in a chokehold. Telling you, y'all weren't outside.
I was like, man, what are you doing? That looked like just ridiculous. He's like, no, man, this is Tony Yayo Dance is doing this thing. And I'm like, I'll do it on TV. And he's like, I dare you.
In the late 2000s, G-Unit began to become less and less influential as 50 Cent became more interested in becoming a major business mogul than a rapper. Then in March of 2007, Yayo was arrested again for the alleged assault of a 14-year-old boy, the son of Jimmy Henchman, and who Tony Yayo personally blames for the game's dissolution with the crew. Despite the arrest, Yayo would maintain his innocence, and 50 would later come through by providing video proof that Yayo wasn't at the scene of the crime when it occurred. The following month, Tony Yayo's mother's home was sprayed in bullets in what is believed to be retaliation by Jimmy Henchman. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, and in early 2008, all charges against Tony Yayo in regards to the case would be dropped. Since then, Yayo has kept busy behind the scenes in all types of hip-hop circles, and his long-rumored second album continues to be just that, a rumor. Although it should be noted that in February of 2022, he posted a new clip of himself to social media, hard at work in the booth, so maybe, just maybe, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to finally get that sophomore album that's been over 15 years in the making. But as for what happens next in the life of Tony Yayo, well, we're just gonna have to wait and see.
All right, y'all, that's it for this video, and I'm out. Peace.